Human trafficking is a billion-dollar business victimizing people. Those who are being exploited for profit call it the life. Nearly 6 million people call America's Dairyland home. It offers all 4 seasons, big sports entertainment, and a small town feel peppered across the state. It easily pleases the eyes and ears. But within the beauty in all 72 counties of Wisconsin is another world unseen by most, with the worst to offer. It's known as the life.
The life for me for a while was my time under condemnation from traffickers and these people that were doing these awful things to myself and my family, right?
Jane is a human trafficking survivor. Most of her childhood in Wisconsin was a nightmare, the same for her siblings.
For us, it was the sex trafficking and the forced labor. So we were forced to work and make money too for our stepdad is what we were supposed to call him. We were used for child pornography, specifically the girls, and there's only 2 of us.
The sexual exploitation went on for several years.
Physical and sexual abuse all happened at the same time, right? Like it was something that happened coherently, right? It usually ended. It started with a beating and it was ended with a beating.
In 2020, the National Human Trafficking Hotline received a total of nearly 52,000 tips related to trafficking in the U.S. Wisconsin bringing in 337 of those reports, a number that could be a lot higher.
It's one of those things that we know it's out there, we know it's prevalent, but yet we're still just scratching the surface of it.
I look at the life as this underworld of despair where awful things are happening and it can be in the public's view, and I think people are just a little naive to the fact that it's actually happening.
Sheboygan County Sheriff's Detective Scott Wieland and Sheboygan Police Detective Brandon Kehoe are trying to remove the blinders by being a part of a multidisciplinary team made up of individuals representing more than 10 different agencies, including Child Protective Services, the Department of Corrections, and Safe Harbor. It's called the Sheboygan County Human Trafficking Task Force. Volunteers meet monthly to plan community outreach for awareness and education on the issue.
Everybody is selfless, they're motivated, they care about this work. We hold each other accountable to make sure that we're accomplishing our goals. That's really what sets us apart from other parts of really not only our state, but I believe this country.
The task force started out big a few years ago when human trafficking were buzzwords.
Not enough individuals are committed to that, and so our group has shrank, but we've become more fluid as a result, and we've become more efficient, I think.
Through events and presentations with schools, law enforcement, public transportation companies, community programs, and more, the task force sheds light on what human trafficking is.
There's the labor side where you have people that are, providing services and, having to kind of not be able to make their own choices. And then there's really the part that's the sex trafficking side. And it's kind of, human trafficking is kind of this umbrella. It encompasses both of those things.
Trafficking is invisible to the untrained eye. It's not necessarily chains and cages in a basement or being snatched by traffickers in a white van while out for a jog.
Generally, that's not the case. There's a relationship that's built. It takes time to form that bond to the point where that potential victim feels trust and that this person is finally looking out for their best interest because they've never had that in their life. And then victimization takes place very quickly after that.
Any person, regardless of age or socioeconomic group, is a target. Social media platforms now a popular trap for traffickers to catch vulnerable youth. Apps like Snapchat with messages meant to disappear is a bonus for traffickers, but a new battle for law enforcement.
It's this difficult entity that exists in our community where people kind of get sucked into it, and by the time they realize that they're in it, it's far too late.
And once sucked into trafficking, detectives say it can happen anywhere.
Really, it happens all over the place. I mean, you can have, obviously, the hotels and motels can be kind of ground zero, so to say. There are houses where you can imagine that certain activity is just kind of accepted, you know, drug use and other things like that.
Trafficking can hide in plain sight.
Meaning human trafficking can occur in front of you and you just not even recognize it. And you may still not recognize it, but it could happen even close to home. And don't think for a moment that it couldn't happen to somebody that you know.
Including children, even while living with their parents.
What we're seeing here in our community is, you know, our youth, for example. You might have, you know, a young girl or boy that has problems at home. Their attendance at school isn't really there. They might be kind of experimenting with drugs. They might have had some trauma, or at least layers of trauma within their life.
There are several indicators of possible human trafficking. For kids, they are showing up at home with new jewelry, electronics, clothes, or tattoos. They skip or stop going to school and stay out late. In public, a person who seems disoriented or wearing clothes they're uncomfortable in, have bruises and/or seem malnourished, could be trafficked. The indicators don't have to be present all at once. Even if there's a doubt, report it to law enforcement. Jane still sees trafficking happening around her in public places.
I used to work at a gas station, and the amount of trafficking that I saw on a daily basis broke my heart.
She says turning a blind eye on what could be someone in danger is what makes the crime nearly unstoppable.
What do you think needs to happen for human trafficking to stop?
I think we need to start opening the curtains, starting to understand that it is here in our community.
Jane vaguely remembers when she was forced into human trafficking, but she does recall being sexually exploited for child pornography at 5 years old.
But as I got older and I started learning what happened and started understanding what happened and how it's still happening, I started to understand that because I'm not under a roof of a trafficker doesn't mean that I'm still not in the life.
One cannot simply choose to walk out of the life after it takes you in, traps you, and breaks you down. Jane lost hope of escaping or being rescued. Years of manipulation led her to believe her only way out was death.
I was wondering when someone would kill me, to be honest. Like, when would it be over? Like, when is this going to be so much that my body's going to give out and I'm just going to die, right? Like, those were the thoughts that I had. And I know I'm not the only one on that.
Jane's fractured safety net was her unwanted ticket to trafficking.
My mom needed to make a means for her children and ended up getting victimized and groomed by a trafficker. I mean, obviously with my mom, she was just preoccupied with her demons that she didn't have time to handle ours as well.
Her mother was a victim as well, leaving Jane to feel unloved and unprotected.
What was used or what was done to make sure that you stayed in the life?
For me, like I said, it was the manipulation of longing for a family and making it feel like I did have a family, and because they did A, B, C, and D, that I had to do A, B, C, and D.
Human trafficking is calculated slavery, using human vulnerabilities such as money, drugs, mental and emotional needs to fuel a business. All tactics used to create a veil of deceit.
Part of what we're doing as a task force is to try to bring awareness to victims, because unfortunately there are a lot of times victims don't see themselves as such.
Trafficking is really complex, and it has so many different layers to it that it can be as subtle as a friend, you know, starting to ask you some questions and getting to know you, and unfortunately maybe giving that person too much information, you know, and then that vulnerability that you might have is exploited.
Romeo pimps is what traffickers who start a romantic relationship with the victim are called. They slowly isolate them, make them dependent on money, drugs, or affection before starting a power control cycle.
We always go back to trafficking, and just abuse in general is typically a power and control setting. So someone has taken that power from you, those decision-making, choices, or they have forced you into something that you don't even realize might not be safe.
I'm officially out of the life, which that didn't really happen until probably a year ago, and even more so recently.
Jane is in her 20s now, living the life she didn't think she could have. One in where she's found her identity, not a victim. Jane is a survivor.
It's not this girl who is this toy, but more of a girl who can make a difference and shed light into darkness.
She wants change.
Would you say the system failed you?
So I would 100% say that the system is broken.
From one foster home to another, Jane struggled to find support.
I think we just need to be doing more as a state to really protect these kids.
We took Jane's plea to the state capitol.
What are you trying to do to make sure survivors are not being failed?
Yeah, there's been a real change in our understanding of human trafficking over the years. I think if you were to look back 20 or 30 years ago, you would see a lot of people who were charged with prostitution offenses. And what we now recognize, I think much more accurately, is that in many, many cases, people who were being charged in those cases are themselves actually survivors of human trafficking.
Attorney General Josh Call says there's been a shift to a victim-centric approach when handling investigations on human trafficking to hold perpetrators accountable and offer victims assistance from agencies partnered with law enforcement. Still, he says more must be done.
One of the challenges with human trafficking is it's often hidden, and so people often evade detection, and unfortunately there's not as much reporting as we would like to see. So the scale of it is hard to fully know.
The Uniform Crime Reporting data on the State's Department of Justice's website shows human trafficking offenses from 2019 to 2021 went down. However, it doesn't necessarily mean human trafficking is slowing down. It could be that reportings of the crime are dropping. But when they are reported, a victim's fear of running into the law can slow justice down.
They can be difficult cases to prosecute, and the reason is this. As we talked about, human traffickers try to take advantage of people being isolated, and often when an arrest is initially made, a victim may not want to be cooperative with law enforcement.
Call says the state launched an anti-human trafficking task force in 2022 where law enforcement agencies are better connected, victims receive resources, and traffickers are held accountable. Call says he's working with agencies to stop cases from slipping through the cracks by supporting the Safe Harbor Bill, which would prohibit anyone under the age of 18 from being charged with prostitution. It's received bipartisan support for several years, but has yet to be passed. Back in Sheboygan, the Human Trafficking Task Force is planning to draft up a piece of legislation aimed at preventing what they call a gateway to trafficking.
I screen the runaway referrals. For every runaway in the county, I get the police report for that and I screen those. So when I look at those cases, or I look at my cases, I'm looking at the same type of indicators. A lot of those are their drug use, their running away and their motivation behind the running away, and then also their trauma history.
The task force wants harboring a missing juvenile to be a crime in Wisconsin. Sheboygan Police Detective Brandon Kehoe, a task force member, says it's only an ordinance violation, limiting what law enforcement can do if a runaway ends up in a dangerous home where human trafficking could already be happening.
I think that's how we disrupt things, by putting so much energy into prevention and looking at, okay, who are the potential victims that we see right now in our community that aren't victims yet, but certainly are going that way.
Jane says that's an approach she believes can make a difference.
Just like being proactive and starting to invest in these people before someone else is filling the gap. Because I promise you, pimps, that's where they're coming from, is they're filling in the gap of where people need help.
She wants anyone in the same darkness she once lived in to remember that light breaks through.